Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. We are now 2 weeks into the court-martial hearing of Private Bradley Manning. Manning was, according to his own testimony in February, the source behind the hundreds of thousands of confidential U.S. documents released by Wikileaks in 2010. Manning's pre-trial hearings received relatively little news coverage. Now, U.S. media outlets appear more interested in the case, but the reporting is still scant, because for every 5 accreditation requests made, the Pentagon turned down 4 of them. This trial is worth watching because of the implications for whistleblowers and the U.S. journalistic organizations that rely on government insiders so that Americans know what the Obama administration and the government are doing in their name. The case also has ramifications for Edward Snowden, the source of the recent Guardian stories on U.S. intelligence agencies and their surveillance capabilities that may well extend to the phone records of just about every American, as well as their online correspondence. Snowden is already undergoing the same kind of trial by media that Manning received before getting to court. In the second half of the program, we have a feature-length, exclusive interview with Julian Assange, whose own legal status in the U.S. may well be affected by what happens at the Manning court-martial. However, our starting point this week is a military courtroom in Fort Meade, Maryland, and the coverage of the trial of Bradley Manning.
This is not just any old court-martial. It's of immense interest to the entire world, to the entire world media.
At issue in the Manning trial is the competition between the intelligence sector versus the press.
The Obama administration has been very aggressive in prosecuting whistleblowers.
I'm concerned about the disclosure of sensitive information from the battlefield.
But the media serves its public. And if the public doesn't care, pretty soon the story's going to disappear.
It took more than 3 years for the Manning court-martial to begin at Fort Meade. 80% of the accreditation requests made by journalists and interested parties were turned down by the military. And the case for the prosecution, much of it, may never be revealed, let alone reported.
I call it Fort George Orwell Meade because, you know, this is really about misinformation and managing the message out of Fort Meade. This court-martial has been conducted with no public docket. We don't get to see the court rulings, we don't get to read the transcripts, we don't get to see any of the government's filings. So essentially whatever we're getting on the record is what we have to use.
They're going to hold a lot of the proceedings in secret, in which they make claims of national security, and then they convict Manning, and we don't know what they are. Now, my book's about the Pentagon Papers. That case was held substantially all in secret. And when you look at those claims, by the way, they don't amount to much in the light of history. And if you can convict Manning the same way, I would predict when you open up those claims, they're not going to hold up. So it's in the government's interest to have as much secrecy as they possibly can have about this case.
That's going to be watched very closely, and if there's a sense that this trial was shielded excessively from public view, that we're not hearing all the facts, that the decision can't be supported by the information that has been made public, I think then there's going to be a great deal of anger on some people's parts.
When Bradley Manning was arrested 3 years ago, the U.S. military put him in solitary confinement, and the Manning story went into a black hole of news. Many of the same outlets that published stories based on what Manning sent to Wikileaks gave the case short shrift. The New York Times, which partnered with Wikileaks on the Afghan war logs, was one of them. 3 times now, the paper has been admonished by its own ombudsperson for failing to cover the Manning story properly. And what coverage there has been in U.S. mainstream outlets has given media critics plenty to work with.
The dominant news narrative in the Manning case is embittered homosexual lashes out at the U.S. Army and the United States of America because he's been tricked by a globe-trotting hacker who is pretending to be a journalist. And it does not match to reality.
The fundamental flaw in American news coverage about the Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks story is to see them as a terrible threat. Now, perfect security does not exist except for in the minds of small children. And real risk analysis and threat analysis is always comparative. And we have to weigh the costs and benefits of relative openness that we've achieved thanks to Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks to the serious threat of extreme levels of government secrecy that we live with already.
For whatever reason, established media has been giving Obama a pass, and they don't seem to have been interested in what he's been doing all along with respect to the press, which is to say that he's indicted 6 leakers. He's been chasing James Risen, the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the New York Times, for a leak. Since the press has forgotten all about that, they've easily forgotten all about Assange and Manning, because those two are on the bottom of the list of the abuses that they would ordinarily pay attention to.
Everybody in the world right now is looking for Ed Snowden.
The whistleblower topping news agendas these days is Edward Snowden, the national security agency contractor who revealed, through the UK's Guardian newspaper, the extent of the agency's monitoring of the phone records and emails of American citizens. Comparisons were quickly drawn between the Snowden and Manning cases, although they differ both in the nature and scale of what they revealed, as well as the value the two men placed on their anonymity. Manning tried to protect his, Snowden did the opposite.
He clearly seems to have made a calculation that by being very public and open about this, perhaps that offers him a measure of protection. Perhaps those who have been concerned or outraged by the revelations will rally behind him and help to secure his safety and freedom. You know, he's also made the point, and this, you know, I'm sure is going to be scrutinized heavily, but that he was very discriminating in what he chose to release.
If I had just wanted to harm the U.S., you know, that you could shut down the surveillance system in an afternoon.
The trouble with Manning's whistleblowing is that it's so voluminous. You know, it's hard to say it's a whistle. I mean, it's like a whole band, but in this case, it's rather discreet. He's talking about discrete program, and he's saying that it shouldn't go into effect until it's debated by the United States public.
A common response among even very liberal people in the US to WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning is to shake their head and say, this is putting us on the slippery slope to too much transparency, to total transparency. Really, nothing could be further from the truth. We have an exponential increase over the past several years of how many documents the government classifies. In 2011, which is the last count, the government classified 92 million documents, up from 77 million the year before, up from 17 million in 2003. There is an extreme phenomenon going on, but it's not extreme transparency. It's extreme secrecy and overclassification. And what Bradley Manning leaked, not even 1% of what Washington classifies in any given year.
The Listening Post sent a series of questions on the Manning and Snowden stories to both the White House and the Pentagon. Neither responded. Roughly speaking, Glenn Greenwald is to Edward Snowden what Julian Assange was to Bradley Manning. Greenwald, a writer and commentator for The Guardian, took the source's classified information, published it, and like Assange, now has American politicians calling for his prosecution.
Legal action should be taken against him.
And why would Edward Snowden, an American, take his story to a British paper, The Guardian, rather than the publication that printed the Pentagon Papers and later partnered with Wikileaks, the New York Times? Laura Poitras, a journalist who worked with Snowden, told Salon.com that Snowden remembers that in 2004, New York Times journalists learned of the warrantless wiretapping of Americans under the Bush administration, but the paper shelved that story for a year at the White House's request. Snowden, she said, became suspicious of some of the mainstream media, including America's newspaper of record. Snowden might have also noted in 2010 the way the Times filled its pages with the news Bradley Manning supplied and then provided minimal coverage of his legal case.
The mainstream media failed utterly in the build-up to the war in Iraq, and it should be no surprise that they have also failed in the coverage of analyzing the war, including analyzing their own failures.
We know most of Iraq is safe, 80% of it.
This is another failure, the way they've treated Bradley Manning. Messengers should not be shot. Lightbringers should not be demonized. Whistleblowers are not a threat to U.S. foreign policy or to American national security. They are a solution, not a problem.
Our Global Village voices now on the coverage of Bradley Manning.
the military chose to deny over 200 people access to covering the trial from a media center. What this says and should say to people throughout the world is that the military is content to control the coverage however they want, and they will only grant openness that fits what they are willing to allow.
The importance of Edward Snowden becoming a whistleblower and going public with his name cannot be underestimated. What's also important is the fact that he went to The Guardian and The Washington Post. The Washington Post, of course, is old school media, more traditional and more likely to go to the White House to get permission. The Guardian and Glenn Greenwald, a campaigning, activist, commentator, lawyer and journalist, is far more likely to treat Snowden with sympathy.
The US government has indicated that they have very few barriers for their treatment of people who reveal official secrets, and they've done that because they want to chill any potential whistleblowers from coming forward. But we now know that whistleblowers will not be deterred. We need to give Manning, Snowden, whoever comes next, our full support and solidarity.
The whistleblowing website Wikileaks first received international attention with the release of a video that it called Collateral Murder. That video, which came from the cockpit of a U.S. military helicopter and showed civilians and journalists getting strafed by gunfire in Baghdad, was obtained through Bradley Manning. That was just the start. Then came the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and the diplomatic cables. All, according to Manning, came from him. With the court-martial now proceeding, the Listening Post sat down with the founder and editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, to examine the impact that the trial might have on him and his organization. This coming Wednesday, Assange will have spent exactly 1 year living at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, having sought political asylum due to fears that he would be extradited to Sweden, where he is wanted for questioning regarding alleged sex crimes. Assange says the allegations against him are political, designed to get him to Stockholm and eventually extradited to the U.S. Julian Assange now on the Manning trial, where it may lead, the U.S. Department of Justice spying on journalists, and the future of WikiLeaks. Julian Assange, welcome back to the Listening Post. I want to start with the Manning trial. You argued in a piece that you wrote on day one of the court-martial hearing that the defendant in this case is not Bradley Manning, it's actually the United States of America. What did you mean when you said that?
Well, this is a show trial. 141 prosecution witnesses, it's been set in train for a long time. Any argument that the defense might have, such as his intent, that he didn't mean to harm the United States, that he was acting as a classical whistleblower, that's been taken off the table. As a result, this trial is a foregone conclusion. We know what's going to happen in this trial. So it is merely a matter of public relations. Here we have an example where a precedent is going to be set that if any source inside the US government communicates to a journalist, they're communicating to the public, so therefore they're communicating to US enemies, and the result is a death penalty. So that's frame one. That then feeds in to a second type of prosecution. It feeds into the broader WikiLeaks prosecution. The attack on WikiLeaks is not just an attack on a media organization that's been dealing with an American source. It's an attack on an international media organization that is not based in the United States. This is an application of extraterritorial rule by the US. It is saying it will go after any media organization anywhere in the world that deals with American sources.
350 accreditation requests for the court-martial hearing, 280 of which were turned down. There were 70 journalists, reporters, stenographers in the room on day one. If this is the show trial that you say it is, why would the U.S. authorities turn away so much free coverage?
Well, in a show trial, you have to get the coverage you want. You have to manage the process. And this is a tightly managed process where there's an interior courtroom, the journalists are not allowed in, an exterior courtroom, and then a connection between the two rooms, which can be cut off at any moment. 24 secret witnesses giving secret testimony. That's enough to justify any particular outcome that the court likes, because it can say, well, I made a decision based upon secret testimony. But the majority of witnesses are there to give information in public. The military PR team hovers around the press section, giving answers and feeding lines and so on. So I think this is the nature. If you have 380 journalists, it's not a situation you can possibly manage or have any oversight of. If you have 70, well, maybe you can do it.
On the coverage of the Manning trial, there's been a lot of criticism over the last 3 years of how little news coverage there has been of Bradley Manning. The New York Times has an ombudsperson that's criticized her own newspaper 3 times for failing to cover a story about an alleged source for a series of stories that the Times found fit to publish. What do you make of the mainstream media's reluctance to provide the Manning case with the kind of coverage that you think would be proportionate given its importance?
Let's look what happened in response to the publication. A massive counterattack by the US military intelligence complex, by the White House, by the State Department, across all levels, politically, legally, diplomatically. And so it seems to be the case that the New York Times took a very defensive position, was in fact terrified of losing its place at the establishment table. So this is a matter of dodging bullets, to pull back, to distance themselves from WikiLeaks. And I think that has become a habit in dealing with the WikiLeaks case in the New York Times, to keep distance in order to prevent the attacks that we're receiving ending up on the New York Times desk.
I was looking at the Bradley Manning Support Group Facebook page, and they report up to $1.2 million in donations to his legal fund. Have, to your knowledge, any news organizations in the US or elsewhere made any contributions to that fund?
None. Now that said, I do know of some journalists that we've worked with making individual contributions, but nothing significant.
Is that appropriate, do you think?
I think it's disgraceful. They've also contributed nothing to our defense. We know that for sure.
Then recently there were these cases involving the Associated Press and Fox News in the United States, where it's been revealed that the Department of Justice and the Attorney General Eric Holder had signed off on surveillance, investigations, calling journalists co-conspirators.
We are concerned that the process of news gathering is being criminalized.
Jill Abramson, the executive editor of the New York Times, goes on Face the Nation saying how chilling this is for mainstream news organizations. Everybody in the United States in mainstream media seems to wake up to something that you've been talking about for a few years. You surprised by the way it developed?
We've been saying for a long time, Harvard scholars like Juha Benkler have been saying for a long time, that the behavior of the mainstream press in the United States over the WikiLeaks issue, their failure to hold the line would result in precisely what we saw in the last few months, these attacks on AP and on Fox. It's exactly the same legal attack that is taking place on WikiLeaks. The argument runs that by us dealing with a source, we are conspiring with the source to release information to the public, and therefore we are engaged in conspiracy to commit espionage.
Nobody who believes in journalism likes to see a Department of Justice investigate news organizations the way the DOJ has, but I'm guessing that sitting in the Ecuadorian embassy here in London, there had to be a smile that came across the corner of your face.
Well, we knew it would be helpful, politically helpful to the situation, because all of a sudden, as we predicted, big establishment press organs like AP and Fox were in our boat with us, and of course scrambling madly to get out.
You recently said in an interview that WikiLeaks is winning. You've been trapped in this embassy now for more than 340 days. Bradley Manning's been in custody for 1,100 days. You have said that after the economic blockade against your organization, your fundraising is down by about 95%. WikiLeaks is making less news these days than it did in its heyday in 2010. How is that winning?
Well, I mean, if we look at this ancient Chinese curse, making less news is sometimes all right.
That's not what you got into the game for, though.
WikiLeaks is not just in the news business. WikiLeaks is in the library business. We're winning insofar as that the political position in the important countries for us is stabilizing and moving into our favor. And in relation to the banking blockade, we have major wins against this in the courts in Iceland at all levels. We haven't had a single loss. We've had the European Parliament vote to introduce legislation to stop continuation of that blockade. The increasing strength of WikiLeaks is not that easy to see for the general public, but this is a matter of the foundational support elements, financial, legal, political, our own internal logistical structure. All this has tremendously increased.
We have pulled together 2 million
Documents. We're publishing more documents per day this year than the last year, and last year we were publishing more documents per day than the previous year, and so on.
You have sought asylum here in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since June of 2012, just about a year now, due to fears that if you voluntarily went to Sweden to answer questions relating to that case, that you would be extradited to the United States. If the Swedish government guaranteed that if you went back there, that they would not extradite you to the United States, would you go, or do you not even want to go there and you want to just keep this to the whole legal case as it relates to the behavior of the British government?
Well, that's what we have demanded. The Swedish government should have come here. That's what they do in other cases. They should have explained themselves. They haven't done that. But, okay, given that they're not doing that, what can be done? Well, we have also said, well, if you refuse to do that, fine, then I will go to Sweden. We just want one thing, which we promise, that I will not be extradited to the United States. In relation to Wikileaks, the Ecuadorian government, as a state, has requested that diplomatically. The Swedish government refuses to do it. The British government has a legal ability to request the Swedish government not do that. The British government has refused to do it. You have to understand the geopolitics here. Sweden and the United Kingdom are perfectly capable informally of telling the United States, hey, we don't like this situation. But what they will never ever do is publicly say no to the United States or look like they have publicly protected me from the United States. That is impossible. And that is why the Swedes will refuse to give that guarantee, although they can. It's also why the British will refuse to give that guarantee, although they can.
You're running for a Senate seat in Australia. The election is coming up in September. How are you able to run a political campaign for a position in Australia from an Ecuadorian embassy in the UK?
In London.
Doesn't leave a lot of time for conventional campaigning.
Where I have asylum in relation to the US triggered by a Swedish extradition order.
It's not complicated, but how do you do it?
Well, we have a pretty good team in Australia, and that team has arisen as a result of fighting to defend Wikileaks, the organisation, to defend its values, and to defend our sources, to defend me. How can I physically be involved in the campaign? Well, you know, the internet's a pretty impressive thing. And so we've built a little TV studio, and I'm able to beam in. And we've tested this successfully in a few places across the world now. It works.
Some political handlers like to minimize the exposure of the candidate to the electorate. Maybe you're the perfect candidate for that, though.
Yeah, I wondered about that, but you know, it seems good when I appear.
I first interviewed you back in November of 2010, and I asked you, as more and more politicians in the United States were taking issue and making noises about you and WikiLeaks, I asked you where you saw yourself in 5 years' time, in 2015, and you said,
the way things are going, what do I do? Apply for refugee status in Cuba? Apply for refugee status into Russia? Has the West really betrayed its ideals, its Enlightenment ideals, to such a degree where I even have to think about that?
So, same question. Where do you see yourself in 2 years, in 2015, and what will become of your organization?
Well, let's go back to the comment I made then. I was half joking. I hoped that I was half joking. Turns out I wasn't joking at all. I think the situation here will probably be resolved in 2 years. I'd be reasonably surprised if it wasn't. The factors that underpin this situation as time goes by are all in our favour. The cost, the publicly disclosed cost of the British policing operation, now at $5 million, completely absurd, is only increasing as time goes by. The length that this has been going on for is only increasing as time goes by. The broader support for us is only increasing as time goes by. So I think those factors must push to a position where the situation becomes untenable.
Julian Assange, thanks for talking to us here at the Listening Post.
You're most welcome.
Julian Assange will continue to follow the Manning trial from the embassy. We'll be keeping a close eye on it, as well as the Edward Snowden case. All three men are at the heart of an important debate in America about balancing the need for security against the right to information and the future of journalism in the digital age. We're back to the usual format next week. We'll see you then here at the Listening Post.